On the behalf of Vice Chancellor Dr. PIDE, I welcome all of you on this book launch seminar. The book title is The Struggle for Hegemony in Pakistan. So the author of book is Dr. Aasim Sajjad Akhtar, Associate Professor, Qaid-e-Azam University, Islamabad. And we are lucky we have Dr. Tariq Banuri, Chairman HEC, as a discussant. So, and the moderator of the session is Abbas Moosvi, Research Fellow at PIDE. So the idea of this, how different institutions reshape their capital in terms of defining the outcome of the society. So with this background, the book is particularly interested for all of us in terms of looking into the way we are dealing currently the political landscape of the country and how the narrative they are trying to like develop in terms of creating the buying power within the nation, and then the way they are dividing the nation based on the different narrative and the different argument they are pushing. So with this fractured like the society, it is pertinent to us to look into the way how we can reconcile our society. What are the way to think beyond the self-interest and to develop a society? The question that come into my mind is that just like Aasim said, why a nation fails. So the question for us that why we fail. So this is the key question of this seminar and the behind this book. So with this, I request Dr. Aasim Sajjad for like giving a brief presentation that would be followed by the discussion and the moderation moderated by the Abbas. So over to Abbas.
Yeah, hi everybody. I hope everyone can hear me. Appreciate you all taking the time out today and joining us. I was hoping that there'd be more people, but I guess we like to stick to our bubbles. But it's all good. I guess we can start. This is going to be the book launch for Dr. Aasim Sajjad Akhtar's new book, The Struggle for Hegemony in Pakistan. I guess we can start off with like a brief definition of what hegemony sort of means. The difference between hegemony and dominance outright is that domination is sort of explicit, right? Hegemony, on the other hand, is sort of where you create the kind of consent in the people in almost an artificial sort of a way where they become apathetic over time and they sort of accept their conditions as natural and sort of like to be expected, right? This is very relevant to knowledge production in particular, something that we are heavily involved in at PIDE, being economists, researchers, professors, what have you. Because the knowledge production in the traditional sense within economists is essentially based on like the free market sort of ideology where you have policy prescriptions, sort of tinkering at the margin sort of approach. There's no structural critique. We sort of miss the forest for the trees. It sort of reminds me of this famous quote by Noam Chomsky, who said that the smart way to keep people passive and obedient is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinion, but allow very lively debate within that spectrum, right? So we seem to be stuck in the global south, in Latin America, sub-Saharan Africa, in the cycle of transforming key institutions into sort of facilitators for big capital, where we sort of populate our top positions with people that are willing to pledge allegiance to this sort of regressive neo-colonial kind of ideology. We see it in the approach that international financial institutions take with their structural adjustment programs, where they push privatization, deregulation, laissez-faire capitalism, and so on. Obviously, this is all linked to dependency theory, core peripheries. Dr. Banuri was a good friend of Emanuel Wallerstein, one of the fathers of the school of thought. In recent times, we've seen Imran Khan sort of emerge as this purportedly anti-imperialist sort of figure, but he makes no reference to the donor community who has a sort of free hand in dictating Pakistan's policies. He makes no mention to ethnic peripheries, religious minorities, transgendered individuals, females, what have you, right? So anti-imperialism at its fundamental level refers to this sort of like centering ordinary people in the process, right? It doesn't just mean talking about fahashi culture and whatnot. And so like we should try to think about the demographics of Imran Khan's sort of audience, this urban sort of middle class. What exactly is their ideology, right? There are two facets to this, and one is that the idea that all of their problems will sort of disappear as long as they sort of pull themselves up by the bootstraps, they work hard. To paraphrase Dr. Aasim in his book, if they're only sort of incorporated it into the circuits of capital around the world, then all of their problems will disappear. The other facet to this is where they're made to sort of otherize marginalized communities, like I said, ethnic peripheries, this idea of corrupt politicians, religious minorities, and so on. So if only these sort of unruly masses would get out of the way, then all of our problems would disappear. On the other hand, we have sort of the rise of technology, which has been sort of, on the one hand, it's sort of democratized the process. It's allowed for more people to participate in the political process. But on the other hand, it's polarized us. We can't really talk to each other anymore. We have our bubbles, our echo chambers. And it sort of created this impression that tweets and Facebook posts, forwarded texts on WhatsApp can substitute, can fill in for true, genuine sort of political activism. So that's also something we should try to reflect upon. So like what is to be done here, right? How can we sort of incubate a kind of political project that, to quote Dr. Aasim from his book, becomes the basis of an emancipatory collective subject rather than a sort of dramatic race to the bottom based on hate of the proverbial other. I want to introduce our panelists today. Dr. Aasim Sajjad Akhtar is associate professor at Quaid-e-Azam University. He teaches political economy at the National Institute of Pakistan Studies. And we also have Dr. Tariq Banuri, chairman of the Higher Education Commission, as our discussant for this evening. Dr. Tariq Banuri is actually a great example of all the problems that we are plagued with. The way we've sort of treated him, the way we sort of treat our decorated academics, people that have achieved everything, we don't seem to appreciate the people that can really contribute something good. So I want everyone to join me in welcoming Dr. Tariq Banuri with us today. And with that, I'd like to invite Dr. Aasim to the podium for his opening monologue. Thank you.
All right, Abbas, thank you to yourself, to PIDE, to all of you who've braved the heat to come, or maybe you haven't braved any heat and you're just coming from one air-conditioned room to another. And of course to Dr. Banuri for both this on this occasion and a couple of weeks ago when we first did a launch, he also showed up there. I didn't realize he was interested in my academic work. I know he knows a lot about how bureaucratic protocols have tried to stop me from doing academic work, but we'll save that for another time. So thank you all for being here and for taking the time to engage with this book. And of course, that's why we write books, so that people read them and engage with them. Unfortunately, that's not a culture or a tradition that is, in a sense, encouraged in this society. So, in a sense, what I would like more than anything else is that people actually read it. Rather than assume that they know what's inside of it. There's a lot there. I've tried to do a lot, perhaps a bit too much. So what I'll do is, because I'm sure very few of you have read it till now, I'll try and give you some tidbits about this book and why I wrote it. Abbas mentioned the word hegemony and sort of gave you a very quick, in a sense, definition of what hegemony is. As it turns out, this is not the first book I've written about hegemony. I wrote my previous book, which was a sort of an iteration of what was my PhD thesis, was also about hegemony. And it engaged specifically with the work of one of Pakistan's probably preeminent social scientist, Hamza Alvi. And I dared to critique Hamza Alvi substantially in that initial book, precisely because I felt that his formulations about, and most famously the formulation I engaged was with a sort of a theoretical formulation about the post-colonial state, which he famously called overdeveloped. And I won't get into that, but what I wanted to share with you is that the first book basically said, or was the premise of the book was, no matter what kind of theoretical formulation you have or how influential it is, and Hamza Alvi's formulation was very influential, not just in terms of thinking about Pakistan, but post-colonial states at large. And there was a series of reflections inspired by Alvi's work about then the post-colonial state in Africa and in many other parts of Asia, Africa, Latin America. But I felt that despite its significant explanatory power, the explanation was static. It wasn't able to account for the fact that when he wrote it, let's say in the 1970s, things looked different. Society looked different, to put it quite simply. There were less people. We had yet to, well, we're in the process of undergoing the processes of urbanization that have intensified rapidly with time. Most of society was still associated with agriculture. I mean, there was many different things that one could point to, but the point being that any kind of theoretical formulation that is static, that doesn't account for change, and I don't mean the Imran Khan type of change, I mean change broadly speaking, change in class structures, change in different sectors of the economy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Change even in how politics is done and articulated. So Pakistan, and I'd say much of the post-colonial world, is this rather eclectic mix of a lot of continuity, including the way statecraft is thought about and done. There's a lot of continuity. Most people in power still think of themselves sort of like entitled colonial masters who can do what they want. But there's also a lot of change. Who becomes sort of a colonial style bureaucrat now? It's different from back in the day, I believe, when Dr. Banuri would join the civil service. The kinds of classes, ethnic groups that have access to employment in the state services has also changed. And that's why it's important to think about things like hegemony. Because hegemony, I mean, in a sense, it would be easy if our societies were characterized only by the use of force. There's a lot of force, don't get me wrong. There's excessive use of force, and force doesn't just mean physical force, it means various kinds of coercion. It can mean economic coercion as well, which is a big and important thing for us to think about. But there is also, however you choose to describe it, there's also, at least in important segments, there's a lot of co-optation as well. There's this sense that you can sort of climb the ladder by playing the established rules of the game. And that means different things. It means for someone in the state bureaucracy to play according to the actual rules of the game as opposed to the rules that are written down in the book. It means for ordinary people to navigate a very exploitative social universe by deploying connections. If you think about it, everyone in this country, whenever they go to some kind of office, they don't generally stand in line. They're always looking for someone they know, either before they get there or after they get there. Those are the established rules of the game. It means finding mediators who will help you deal with the daily excesses of the thana and the kacheri, which, as you know, are quite brutally difficult institutions to manage or to maneuver. So in a sense, what I want to just start off by saying is that we have to be able to think about these are continuities, certainly, but there is also a lot of stuff that is different. To take one of the examples that I flesh out in this book, right? And this is should be of interest to you in an institution of development economics. You know, what broadly speaking, 50, 60 years ago, and this sort of helps us also engage with these questions of how even fields of study and ideas of economic development have, you know, particular kinds have been mainstreamed, other kinds have been marginalized. Back in the day, for a newly independent country like Pakistan, the idea was, okay, we're going to now take as much surplus as we can generate and try and invest in industry, and develop a strong domestic manufacturing base, and that will help us, at least over time, extricate ourselves from dependencies that were colonial era dependencies, right? i.e., we are a captive market for raw materials, and we end up buying back at 10 times the price, like something that someone has packaged in another country and sold it back to us. But now we say this, we say that we're still committed to doing stuff like this, especially when you talk about, for instance, CPEC and so on. But the truth is, and if we observe and if we look at, in some ways, figures and statistics sort of will corroborate this. Someone with money, excess capital, will basically buy a plot of land, enclose it, and start selling files to the plots. Okay, and this is broadly exceeds to processes that are global, right? Which globally are called, essentially, the global capitalist system has largely gone through a process of substantial financialization. So rather than making money in traditional ways by hiring cheap labor and sort of making as much of a margin as you can through the fruits of their labor, I'm not saying that doesn't happen anymore, but there is a big shift towards what we call financialization, right? So gated housing schemes being perhaps the most, the biggest important prototype. Obviously investing in other speculative sectors like stock market. And that's why, and I'll get back to the book, but that's why most of our debate, we were just discussing informally, most of our debate is about, okay, the dollar is plunging and the stock market is collapsing. And that sort of is a catchphrase for everything economic, right? And if you'll observe the last 3 months in our sort of public sphere, all that's been happening is, who and when will the fuel subsidy be removed? There's no debate about anything else. It's just about whether they will have removed it or they sort of press pause and then put it into this government's sort of, in a sense, force them to take on this burden. But that's it. Now, I don't need to get into any debate about whether this is good or bad. I'm just sharing with you the limits of the debate. There is no debate, frankly. The other thing, and this takes me to my book, which is sort of one of the main emphases of the book, is that what you see happening in Pakistan in the realm of politics is less exceptional than you might think. Pakistanis, because we're taught Pakistan studies from day one, tend to think of ourselves as very exceptional. Whether we have the orthodox view, which is that, this was a homeland made for Muslims and non-Muslims are always out to destroy us, or you even have a critical view, which thinks about things like the two-nation theory with a degree of skepticism, and all of the other institutional forms of power that draw on those sorts of so-called theory. Either way, we tend to think of ourselves in somewhat exceptionally. One of the classic examples of that is the absence of liberal democracy, right? We have a bloated military apparatus, again, somewhat of a legacy from colonial rule. It's always been patronized by, well, not always, but for large parts of our history, patronized by the West to fight XYZ wars. But this is what we see happening in Pakistan today, and because this particular book focuses on essentially the period that starts after the end of the Cold War, where I would argue that debate, policy, all of it has basically just, in a sense, everything has shrunk, right? There is no debate, as I said. Or famously, there was a term that they called TINA, there is no alternative. There is only one way of making policy, there is only one way of thinking about developing societies, and there is no alternative, i.e. after the end of the Cold War. So these are problems, or these are sort of quandaries that I would argue are not just specific to Pakistan. So look next door, right? People like myself included would often suggest, well, in comparison to Pakistan, there's India, right? And India doesn't have this over-bloated national security apparatus always, sort of asserting itself versus civilians. India doesn't have a polity where religion is weaponized, but it certainly looks like in the last 15 or 20 years that there's a greater convergence than even myself I would have ever thought was possible 20 years ago. We can extend that further. Look at Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka was in some ways the relative success story of South Asia, at least through the 1980s. Great health education indicators, sort of substantial spending on people's welfare. But Sri Lanka, to put it, I mean, to sort of give you a simplistic explanation, opened up its economy so much in the post-Cold War world that a couple of years where tourists don't show up and the economy literally falls through the cracks. So these are all not exactly the same, but these are all symptoms of what I consider to be a broader global problem. Look at the West. So much of the literature that I engage with in this book actually is specific to the Western context, right? So post 2007, when the neoliberal bubble burst through what we call the global financial crisis, which, mind you, was largely a housing crisis, right? What we call the subprime mortgage crisis, in a sense, where financial institutions gave a series of bad loans to continue being able to generate speculative returns on bad assets, which in this case are housing assets. And the bubble burst, and we had the global financial crisis. And subsequent to that, in large parts of the West, there's what has been written about is the crisis of the political that has followed, which is embodied by individuals like Trump or Boris Johnson, right? Or there could be any number of others. For instance, Macron just scraped through an election against a far-right candidate, I believe last month or the month before. And there could be many other examples. So you essentially, in countries which have boasted a long history of uninterrupted democratic processes, and presumably also a lot of prosperity derived from sort of neoliberal open markets and so on and so forth, all of them around the world in various degrees and measures are now suffering a series of fallouts. Those fallouts are economic, those fallouts are political, and those fallouts often politically don't happen by someone coming in and launching a coup. They're happening by people coming to power through electoral means. Modi wins elections. Trump wins elections. Boris Johnson wins elections. They don't sort of come in through the back door. And so now if I take this to Pakistan, this book is basically trying to do a number of different things. One is for us to force us to think about these somewhat simplistic trajectories. If we tick 3 boxes, then everything will be okay, right? So for instance, if we this time really follow through on the IMF program, because the problem is not that according to the mainstream. The problem is not that we don't, the problem is in fact that we don't follow through on the IMF's conditionalities. That's what the IMF says, and that's largely what most of our mainstream politicians say to one another, right? So someone in power didn't do it. When we come into power, we will do it better. Yeah? The problem is that we don't have some kind of unadulterated liberal democracy, right? And if you sort of take, apparently, let's just say, if we don't have a counterfactual, but if you took the military out of the story, then perhaps everything would be hunky-dory. But the rest of the world doesn't confirm those hypothetical claims. So we have to think beyond that, okay? And what I'm trying to offer you in this book is sort of a series of both vignettes about what's happening, especially in our peripheries. So I offer 4 vignettes. One is Gwadar. One is the Thar Desert. Yeah. One is the monstrosity known as Beria Town on the Karachi-Hyderabad superhighway, which literally you can drive for kilometers and you will just see a series of lights, the world's biggest golf course and the world's biggest masjid. This is how they advertise it. And a fourth is what is called the Ravi Riverfront City, or I don't know what it's called, Ravi Riverfront City. Salman Raja's here, maybe he can give us the exact name. But Ruda is the development authority, but it's called the Ravi Riverfront. This is a crazy, crazy imaginary that about 30 kilometers outside of Lahore, moving on towards Sheikhupura, they will create a city which will ultimately house about 10 million people. So it's like we have Dubai in Gwadar and we have Dubai in Lahore as well, right? And these are imaginaries that are based on, and that's what I'll share with you. They're not based completely on hogwash because they do attract and they do appeal to certain segments of the population. Okay, so let me give you the crux of the book. The crux of the book is that our contemporary hegemonic structure is based on something that I call the middle class aspiration. Okay, let me just sort of clarify that term. The book is not about the middle class. Okay, I'm not writing about the middle class. I'm writing about the middle class as a prop of ideology. Okay, it's an ideological construct. Now, that's not to say it doesn't exist, because it does exist. If I asked most of you here, you'd probably call yourself middle class. That's precisely why this term is very powerful, because a lot of people, especially young people, would sort of unproblematically think of themselves as middle class. Now, let me tell you why this is not that you can't call yourself middle class, but why I think it's a problem. So through the neoliberal success years, and by neoliberal success years, I mean when the Soviet bloc collapses and Francis Fukuyama tells us that this is the end of history and there's going to be doodh aur shahad ki nehrein, and there will just be capitalism and liberal democracy and everything will be A-okay. One of the major, in a sense, you could argue, beneficiaries of opening up the world to, in some ways, globalizing capital was, especially in China, in India, was what people called a global middle class. So people who literally, to make it a little bit more dramatic, a rags to riches type of story. Okay, I find this remarkably similar to another similar kind of ideological story, which has animated American politics for most of its history, which is called the American Dream. And the American Dream is something similar. No matter where you come from, no matter what your constraints, no matter what your background, you can, through sheer dint of hard work, make it, right? You can in some ways climb up the social ladder and acquire a comfortable, sort of dignified middle class life. And for a while, that appeared to be largely true as a global story, especially in the non-Western world, especially in Asia. I argue that Asia is the major frontier of neoliberal globalization, largely because of China, right? Because that's where all or large parts of Western manufacturing was outsourced. But also in India. Now, India was a classic success story, right? Remember the Indian tech industry in Bangalore, right? Then India being housing the global pharmaceuticals, basically manufacturing generic medicines. You know, for instance, you'll know that India was a big hub of COVID vaccines. It's another matter that there was an absurdity that a lot of Indians were dying from COVID, not having access to those vaccines, but that's sort of how so-called free markets tend to work. But the middle class, sort of a sort of rags to riches story, perhaps from a rural background, went into an urban area, became associated with like pharmaceuticals or tech industry. In Bangladesh, there was another sort of very well choreographed. Again, I'm not suggesting there's no truth here, but I'm offering you a specific kind of argument, which was a feminized manufacturing industry. So Bangladesh is often compared to Pakistan as having done much better because there's far less constraints on women coming into the labor force. And, you know, all of our Gap t-shirts and all of our big multinational t-shirts, often you'll find a made in Bangladesh sort of tag. So for a while, there's this idea that you open up your markets and you have a good, so functioning liberal democracy and you can succeed. But then from 2007 onwards, that dream started to look really sour. First in the West, which started to, ironically, the same sort of Western powers and countries and economies that had propagated the idea of opening up the world after the collapse of the Soviet Union and allowing free entry and exit of capital, and sometimes even labor, so that they could have access to cheap supplies of labor. For instance, when I was living in the United States in the 90s, at the peak of neoliberal triumphalism, they had just signed what was called the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, 1994, with America, Canada, and Mexico. And so the idea was cheap Mexican immigrant labor would come into America and basically, especially in like service industries, like hoteling and so on and so forth. And similarly, American, you know, manufacturers would go house themselves across the border in Mexico and take advantage of severely or much less expensive labor costs. Of course, this happened globally in China and so on and so forth. And so after 2007, you know, you see the rise of a right wing saying, well, they've taken away all our jobs. And who's taken away all our jobs? Not Trump himself, because of course Trump is a beneficiary of globalization in a sense, but the other. Some brown, black guy who we allowed into our country because we were too lax with our immigration laws, right? Someone, just say Abbas was saying just now, someone who doesn't fall into the conventional category of gender as we know it, and therefore is spreading fahashi, right? Some other, like a racialized other, a gendered other, and then that other can also take the form of a foreign country entirely. It's quite remarkable. You'll see that this foreign conspiracy business is not just limited to Pakistan. It's everywhere. Let me just read you a paragraph, okay? Just to give you a sense of what I'm suggesting. Which is to in some ways to bring not just to bring Pakistan into conversation with a series of other examples, polities. I conceptualize middle class hegemony in terms of a dialectic of fear and desire. Middle class aspiration engenders the accumulation of wealth through savings, interest, and the acquisition of property and rental income so as to partake in conspicuous consumption, right? Like going and hanging out at Centaurus type. The desire for elevated social status, both at home and actually part of this is also enabled and embodied by digitalization, right? Because this global village, you could be part of that global village while sitting in your own space because you were engaged digitally with the rest of the world. So the desire for elevated social status, both at home and in the digitalized global village, is dialectically conjoined to an other that threatens both the middle class subject, the aspiring middle class subject, and the political community to which this subject pledges allegiance. For the most part, this other is physically proximate and therefore an imminent threat. The toiling classes, right? हमारे यहाँ अगर कोई घर में पैसे गायब हो जाएं तो हर बंद आम तौर पे ये बात होती है कि हम नौकर ने चोरी किया था. Just to give you a very banal example. The disloyal ethnic, racial, or religious community, women and other oppressed genders, political dissidents, and so on. There is always some other that symbolizes one's fears. The struggle from below then, like from, this idea of a rags to riches, rising up through the ranks, to secure some wealth and power entails not only competition with those of a similar aspiration. I often say to my students who want to do CSS, कि भाई CSS में तो पास तो 2% होते हैं, 98% तो fail होते हैं. So in a sense, you are competing with one another, right? That's actually in effect is just a statement of fact. So you're competing with those of a similar aspiration and rejection of those further down the status ladder, many of whose social identities render them intrinsically different or other. The politics of fear is symbiotically connected to state nationalism. Ideological state apparatuses and the mass media continuously invoke the nebulous enemy that threatens from without. The domestic other and the foreign enemy together constitute an unholy nexus that must be subjected at the very least to the watchful surveilling eye of the state and quite often its strong arm. But what I want to emphasize is this, that the strong arm, the violence, the coercion, whether it be in Gwadar, whether it be in Thar, or whether it be somewhere far away where you and I don't bother to go, right? That is enabled by the middle class subject. It doesn't just happen despite sort of mass disapproval. It happens with, in a sense, a substantial segment of society cheering on the state. And if you don't, if I say, well, what about Gwadar's fisher folk? Then somehow I'm anti-development. And what if I say, yeah, but mining coal is passé, actually. It's terrible for the environment. And Thar's coal is particularly dirty, mind you. There's different gradations of coal. It's particularly dirty. Somehow that's not an option, because I'm just supposed to cheer on the process. Not to mention the fact that Gwadar's people or Thar's people or the people whose goats and gowns and villages are emptied to enable these gated housing schemes to come into existence are, in this book, what I using a very old but I think particularly pertinent Marxist concept of surplus populations, right? Or what he would alternatively, what he called the Great Reserve Army of Labor. Okay, I mean, that is, of course, another sort of set of subjects that doesn't enter the equation. So, in a sense, we have a hegemonic structure enabled by a global ideological convergence, which we can trace to the end of the Cold War. That convergence was not, despite its claims, was not designed to, as such, benefit ordinary people, right? It largely facilitated the interests of global investors and obviously their domestic, in a sense, middlemen who did the offshoring and outsourcing. And for a while, there was a sense that this could also benefit large masses of the population, which embodied by this idea of this global middle class. But this model is volatile. It's inherently consistently subject to shocks. It's volatile because it's based on a lot of speculative investments, which ultimately then these bubbles tend to collapse, especially in things like housing. It's volatile because all countries of the world, increasingly so, are connected via these circuits of capital, right? So for instance, as I said, if you have one shock like the pandemic, in India, the statistic is 230 million Indians fell below the poverty line. Remember we saw those images at the height of the lockdown where people are flooding out of cities? Now, on the one hand, we might be thinking, okay, this is the lowest of the low. This is like this is not the middle class. But what I'm trying to suggest to you is what we define middle class. And I don't know if Dr. Nayab is here because she wrote this seminal paper, a PIDE working paper 10 or 12 years ago, where she estimated the size of the Pakistani middle class. If you look at that paper, it makes for very broad reading, right? So this what we're calling the middle class has a great deal of variation. And literally you can become middle class if you have 1 year of a certain level of income. But that also suggests that if that income dries up, then you can also fall through the cracks. It is that way, right? That is sort of what I'm trying to get us to think about. And in essence, then, we have colonial binaries of center and periphery playing out in new ways. You have remote areas full of lush resources, which must service the development of the center, and in which this aspiring middle class subject, at least potentially, imagines themselves as being able to partake in. And the other regime, if there's a regime in which openness of capital and free entry and exit is part of the story, and the other story that I sort of articulate in this book is about the war on terror, because this was a parallel regime. Now, the war on terror is, I think, something for us also to think about in this framework, where you have captive urban populations actively, in a sense, cheering on the coercive state apparatus and saying, "Ha, ye kahin dur daraz ilake mein dehshatgard hai, unko pakadna hai." But the irony of it is कि वो दूर दराज भी नहीं है सिर्फ. I was literally party, डंडे भी खाए और पर्चे भी काटे गए हमारे खिलाफ, to an episode which took place in Islamabad, in this city, right next to the fruit and vegetable market, Mandi ke saath. This was 2015. And this is a sprawling squatter settlement, ironically comprised of people who 30 years ago migrated out from the Pashtun border districts, and particularly from the Momand Agency, when it was kosher to say that jihad hum kar rahe hain kafiron ke khilaf. So large migrant populations come into the city, service the city, wake up at 3 o'clock every morning, go to the mandi, fill their readies with fruit and vegetables, and essentially go into elite sectors and service the rich. They clean their homes, they're domestic servants, they're cooks, right? And this population, approximating 25,000 people in 2015, we worked there for many years, was one day deemed to be, well, not one day, this is quite commonplace, as we know, was deemed to be surplus in a sense, and deemed to be an illegal encroachment, which later on he became very famous for other reasons, because he picked a fight with the ISI, but at the time took a very anti-people stance. Shaukat Siddiqui, who was a judge of the Islamabad High Court, and he said, bulldoze them to the ground. He said, bulldoze them all to the ground. He said to the CDA, why are these illegal populations living in Islamabad? Irony is, someone from that settlement went to the High Court and said, I went to Nadra, and Nadra's not making me an ID card. He's like, they're not making you an ID card? Why? Because I don't have a permanent address. He's like, okay, well, then you should be bulldozed. And he called the CDA into his chambers time and again. And he said, they're all illegal, bulldoze them. We went to the Supreme Court, to Justice Jawad Khwaja's court at the time. I won't get into the details. Justice Saab heard us, but only after this Abadi had been bulldozed. And in the week leading up to the bulldozing, on TV every day, there were tickers that would run. कि ये अफगान हैं, इनके घरों में असला है, ये दहशतगर्द हैं, and true to form दहशतगर्दी एक्ट के तहत बाद में FIR भी काटे गए. But to invoke terror and then to use that as a pretext to wipe out, as I said, this surplus population. And this is in sector I-11. And of course, as expected, 7 years later, when you go there, that sector has been neatly plotted and the average price of a 5 marla plot is about 1.5 crores. And of course, that price is going to skyrocket. So these are examples playing out every day. They can be far away, they can be close to our home in the urban metropolitan center. And these are processes that are intensifying. They're not sort of lessening in intensity. And I would argue, most significantly, these are processes that all of these governments that are coming and going are more or less equally committed to. I don't see any fundamental difference in policy vision or sort of long-term understanding of all of these regimes. So there's 3 structuring facts that I want to share with you. This is Pakistan, South Asia, and then Sub-Saharan Africa, the youngest regions in the world. Approximately 2 billion people. In fact, if you add Sub-Saharan, so closer to 3 billion people, less than 25 years of age. The other thing that I document in this book, which I won't get into because it's a sort of a separate set of debates, is that this population is increasingly digitally connected. So the political or political debate is increasingly migrated to digital spaces, which Abbas rightfully pointed out have their own etiquette and dynamic, and they certainly don't facilitate. You can't really talk about serious things in 140 characters. And the last thing is that this, not Sub-Saharan Africa, but South Asia is heavily, the scientific forecasts are the world's most climate change prone region. We saw that with the heat wave this season. Interestingly, I don't know if you guys followed, but as the heat wave was playing out in the western part of the subcontinent, the eastern part of the subcontinent, Bangladesh and parts of West Bengal, were inundated with floods and a cyclone. In the same sort of season. And this is, again, only likely to intensify. So a population that is exploding demographically, that is more and more prone to polarized forms of political debate because of the way in which, digitalization is playing, at least it's how it plays out in terms of the political sphere, and where underlying crises of a financialized or an increasingly financialized economy and ecological fallouts, partly, by the way, reinforced by this land grabs, water grabs, forest grabs, right? These are all interrelated phenomena. It's not like these things are sort of mutually exclusive. And so the last thing I'll say here is, for me, there's a lot of change, but I said there's a lot of continuity. So I, in a sense, deploy or go back to Fanon to help think through this. Dr. Saab said this, and to me just a little while ago informally, I'm sure he'll talk about this at length. The focus in this book is the subject, thinking about political subjectivity. I acknowledge that, in a sense, I'm not offering a blueprint for a set of objective economic or social policies that would, in principle, be required to sort of represent an alternative. Personally, I'd say because I think it's quite simple. That doesn't mean I couldn't have articulated it, but in a sense, it's quite simple, in the sense that we have to start sort of bringing things back onto the debating table that have disappeared. Right? Why should my measure of economic development or growth be the fact that investors are happy? This is a question I have. I'm not trying to be a raging red revolutionary here, although sort of I am, but it's still a question. Why should my measure of what is good for an economy be determined simply by what is happening in the stock exchange? What about long-term questions of access to traditional livelihoods? Or, okay, if you're wiping out those traditional livelihoods, how are you going to replace? Does anybody talk about job creation anymore? Waise, aapas ki baat hai? I haven't seen it. Aside from a slogan that we once heard about, was it 10 crore naukriyan aur 5 nahi 10 lakh 1 crore naukriyan aur 50 lakh ghar. Na wo 1 crore naukriyan mili, na wo 50 lakh ghar mile. But because this is a serious issue, because we have so many young people, how are we going to meet their livelihood needs? And I'm as concerned about white collar educated segments, let alone the bigger chunk, which doesn't even have access to higher education. There is no plan. So, you know, or cutting our defense sector down to size, or, you know, thinking about all sorts of hidden subsidies, which of course we're talking about the petrol subsidy, but we're not talking about so many others. So that's why perhaps, you know, maybe a bit of an oversight, but I didn't focus on what does an objective program, economic or political program, look like. I focus on the question of political subjectivity, because either way, for me, unless there is a politics that we can imagine and embody, then we can have all of the great ideas we want, but that's not going to be, we're not going to be able to put it into fruition. In fact, the politics that is working, that is succeeding, is one based on othering. It's based on, as I said, this dialectic of fear and desire. You sort of imbue this young middle class subject with desire. And when you cannot meet their needs or you cannot meet their aspirations, then you say, okay, well, go hate on some proverbial other who is responsible for your miseries, right? That can be, you know, as Abbas said, can be the corrupt political elite, right? Or it can be the supporters of the corrupt political elite, or some oppressed gender or caste, or, you know, especially in our country, ethnic group. So there are old tropes, but they are playing out under a transformed social backdrop. And I don't see any articulation of vision, sadly, and I'll close with this, that is as true for progressive circles as it is for the dominant. In fact, the dominant don't have to bother with this because they can keep playing the politics of fear and desire. They can keep doing ke mulk nazuk daur se guzar raha hai. They can keep saying ke ek bairuni sazish hai jiski wajah se hamari tabahi ho rahi hai, etc., etc., etc. This is old news. It's up to, I think, people who are concerned about these questions, who have are willing to think conceptually beyond, out of the box, who don't think that it's passé to talk about colonialism. I certainly don't. Fanon certainly warned us even 50 or 60 years ago that decolonization couldn't just be replacing the Gora Sahab with the Kala Sahab. So for me, this is our challenge. This is not someone else's challenge. And I don't see, in fact, I see this as a crisis of liberal politics everywhere. And I'll close with this. I said this the other day. That's embodied by the fact that the best we can hope for is when Biden comes back to power. The same Biden who was the precursor to Trump. The best we appear to be able to hope for here is the PDM coming back to power. The same PDM that in some senses was created the conditions in which an Imran Khan could thrive. So this sort of vacillating between what Tariq Ali called the extreme center, which includes some of the old 20th century social democratic parties, which don't have anything social democratic to say anymore, and something even further to the right, right? The Frankfurt School called them authoritarian personalities back in the day. we can call it what we want. I prefer not to use the word populism. I find it too broad and too difficult to work with, so I didn't use it. But either way, I was less interested in the personality than the captive audience for that politics, right? Like I said, the middle class aspiring population that can be drawn into this web of hateful politics. So there's a lot more I could say, including about questions of, there's a significant debate that I deal with here about transition, thinking about, the old colonial peripheries. And once upon a time, we used to say they are in a process of transition, and they have yet to achieve a fully formed capitalism. But in a sense, what I'm arguing is that forms of violent, primitive accumulation are not something that's a defining feature of transition. This is very much constitutive of what actual colonial capitalism looks like. I don't see us transitioning to some, classic manufacturing prototype. Mind you, with outsourcing and offshoring and outsourcing, more than 70% of the world's manufacturing processes is already taking place outside of the old first world. For instance, आजकल वो चल रहा है कि हम बड़े खुश हैं कि सियालकोट ने वर्ल्ड कप का फुटबॉल बनाया है. So Pakistan is the world's hub for football making, the football industry, for surgical instruments, right? It also houses a lot of multinational garment firms, right? That, of course, we were talking just a little while ago about the Baldia fire in Karachi a few years ago. So, like I said, there's lots that I could get into. I'll stop because it would be nice to hear what Dr. Saab has to say and the rest of you have to say. But again, I hope that you actually read it, because it's in reading it that you will be able to engage more substantially with what's in here. And of course, some of you will know, most of you will know, I'm not just an academic. So don't just read it, but also think about what it is that we collectively need to be able to start at least thinking about. I don't think there's any shortcut here. I'm really against the shortcut method, because it's a series of shortcuts that have got us to where we are today. I think there has to be a much more medium and long-term sort of thinking that we generate if we want to emerge, both in Pakistan and I would say much of the colonial world, from this sort of, in some ways, cul-de-sac where we're veering from between the extreme center to something even worse. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Aasim. That was a tremendous overview of the book. I'd like to invite Dr. Tariq Banuri to the podium to offer comments, reflections, questions on the book, The Struggle for Hegemony in Pakistan. Thank you.
First of all, my thanks to PIDE and to Abbas in particular, and I assume to Aasim for inviting me to give this talk. When I mentioned to some of my friends, there's this book launch and I'm going to be a discussant. One friend asked me why. It's quite a legitimate question, and I thought I will start with that and then get on to first what I read in the book. It will complement a little bit of what Aasim has already informed us, and then also where I depart from it. The why question is very simple. I do want people to read books. I also want people to write books. And there is not enough, or at least good books. There's not enough of it. काफी discussions में देखता हूँ वो एक जरा surface पे होती हैं. So I think it's very important for us to get to the kind of depth that we need in our intellectual analysis. Number two, in this country, as you know, social sciences, humanities, arts, culture has been degraded for a long time. There's a kind of a brutalization of society that started some time ago, जिसमें इन चीजों को हमने तवज्जो देने जरा कम कर दी. And which is one of the reasons why we keep on getting hit by the same crises every few years, and yet we can't figure out कि हो क्या रहा है. ये वो ऐसी जो कार्टून में होता है कि वो कोई किसी चीज पे पैर रखता है तो उसको एक आके वो लगता है और फिर वो उसको समझ नहीं आती, वो दोबारा पैर रखता है, फिर दोबारा उसको लगता है, फिर गालियां देता है, फिर पैर रखता है, फिर लगता है। हमारे साथ ये हो रहा है, but we haven't really begun to understand this. And I think the fact that our social sciences have not been valued, supported, encouraged is one of the reasons why we are confronted with this situation. And I personally feel that this is something that we need to start doing. The second reason I also, the third reason I should say, I also wanted to come here is in part because I wanted to disagree with Aasim on some points. There's a famous story of a king who asked a scholar, will you come and talk with me? And the scholar said, yes, sir, I will talk to you if you are willing to talk to me like a scholar, but not if you're willing to talk to me like a king. So बादशाह ने पूछा कि what's the difference between these two? उसने कहा, if you disagree with a scholar, you make him happy. If you disagree with a king, you make him unhappy. That's a fundamental difference. When you disagree with a scholar, it makes you happy because this is the way in which we improve what we have to say. तो ये हमारा एक एकेडमिक कल्चर की एक रिवायत है जो कि हम, चूंकि हमारे यहाँ जो है वो एक किस्म का ब्यूरोक्रेटिक कम बाजारी कल्चर जो है वो ज्यादा डोमिनेंट है, तो हम ये चीजें भूल गए. तो मैं ये भी कहना चाहता था कि there are areas in which I will disagree and I feel that is very important for us academics to do. And finally, the reason I wanted to come today is that there is a kind of an idealist project. There is a project कि यार हमें, but how can we improve the lives of people? A very large number of people, including myself, have been engaged with asking this question: कैसे लोगों की जिंदगी improve करें? You know, it's a frustrating question. It's a perennial question. It is a question that every generation needs to answer. And I felt that this is something that, you know, people like myself were doing some time ago. And I looked at Aasim's work and I thought, he's trying to do it. And this is a point where we can come and discuss both our confluences and our disagreements. Now, let me just start with what I thought is, in one sentence, I think Aasim has summarized his entire book. And the sentence he says is this. He says, can the contemporary post-colonial middle-class subject rehabilitate the revolutionary humanism that for some decades in the mid-20th century was a genuinely hegemonic horizon of freedom for all people? बहुत important sentence. बहुत important sentence. Can the contemporary post-colonial middle-class subject rehabilitate the revolutionary humanism that for some decades in the mid-20th century was a genuinely hegemonic horizon of freedom for all people? और सारे जो इसके themes हैं, except perhaps वो IT वगैरह का या ये वो, but सारे themes यहाँ पे हैं. The focus on the subject, the concept of the middle class, post-colonial, where we might have some disagreements, humanism, revolutionary humanism, where you actually see transformation in people's lives, the hegemonic compromise and the hegemonic horizon, and the freedom के ऊपर भी एक focus है, and freedom for all people. I think this is a beautiful sentence, and it absolutely encapsulates the book. तो मैं partly ये दोबारा इसलिए repeat कर रहा हूँ कि, like Aasim, I also want you to read the book, and I thought कि I would give you a key कि इस point से जब आप जाएंगे तो आपको सारी किताब आपके सामने ऐसे खुल के नजर आ जाएगी. And I do congratulate him for the book and for all the issues that he has raised. Now, the thing is that there are sort of different ways in which I can go. One thought I had was to actually try to talk to you for a few minutes on how we in an earlier generation were trying to deal with this, right? हर generation के challenges different होते हैं. हम कई ऐसी चीजें हैं जो उस वक्त नहीं थी, अब इस वक्त आपके सामने कॉमन प्लेस हैं। तो उस वक्त हम कैसे कर रहे थे? There's a paper which, for a totally unrelated reason, I have sent to some friends. I wrote it in originally in 1987-88. It was published in 1990. वो दो उसके वो हैं components हैं, मैं दोनों का नाम दे देता हूँ और then I will tell you what it's about. वो एक का नाम है Modernization and its Discontents, और दूसरा उसका जो कंपेनियन पीस था, इट्स कॉल्ड द डेवलपमेंट एंड द पॉलिटिक्स ऑफ नॉलेज, डेवलपमेंट एंड द पॉलिटिक्स ऑफ नॉलेज। तो आप देखें कि ये जो हेजेमोनिक आइडिया जो है, मतलब हम उसको नॉलेज के और सिस्टम्स ऑफ नॉलेज के थ्रू अप्रोच कर रहे थे। नाउ दिस वाज, एज आई सेड, इट वाज रिटन इन द लेट 1980s एंड we were trying to confront a number of things, and at that time there are 2 or 3 things that we knew. One is that we felt that the development, the idea of development in developing societies had become hegemonic at the time of independence, जो कि तकरीबन World War II के बाद आई. It was a hegemonic idea जिसमें कि उन्होंने societies को एक किस्म का इकट्ठा कर लिया था. तो ये उस वक्त से चल रहा था. तो देखें, अगर आप काउंट करें तो 1945, 47, 48, 49 उस वक्त से ये चीज चलती आ रही थी. I was writing 40 years later. And I said, what the hell is going on? 40 साल हो गए. We have been talking about development. We have given a lot of authority to our state. We have given a lot of authority to our collaborators outside of the country. And we don't see any development. हमें तो कुछ नजर नहीं आ रहा. और हमें उस वक्त ऐसा लग रहा था कि अगले 1000 साल तक there'll be rich societies and poor societies, developed countries and developing countries, and we will forever be condemned to a life of a second-class people in the global community, right? And so the question was, what the hell is going on? इसका कोई मकसद है? ये सिर्फ मकसद है कि हमें खामोश रखना. That was item number 1. The second thing that we were concerned about is कि उस वक्त जब World War II खत्म हुई थी, तो उस वक्त already the socialist idea was quite predominant. In fact, वो तो उसको already एक 50 साल से ज्यादा हो चुके थे. देखिए ना, Marx died in 1883. तो उससे पहले जो है जो internationals हुए and the socialist movements took place. In fact, by the time Marx was writing वो Communist Manifesto, वो कहते हैं, a specter is haunting Europe, the specter of socialism, of communism. तो वो उस वक्त लोग डरे हुए थे उससे. So this was the other idea. And sitting in 1986, we said, look at these countries. What have they done after 70 years? Nothing. This is not a model for us. So on the one hand, you had one vision being presented to you and we thought it was wrong. Another vision being presented to you, it was wrong. And then at the third level, we were already aware of the environmental challenges. And we said कि इधर से climate change आ रहा है. It was a bit early for climate change, लेकिन हमें कुछ नजर आ रहा था. लेकिन दूसरे environmental crisis थे कि वो जो आपने promise हमें build की हुई थी, वो तो promise तो already हम हाथ से निकल जा रही. So that was an attempt to come to terms with some of these challenges. And I think if you were to read this, I'm not trying to force you to read my papers, but I'm just trying to say, if you were to read papers like that, or papers of people who had written at that time about these challenges, you will find that there's a lot of synergy with the kind of things that Aasim is talking about. We were also concerned that it makes a difference how you think about the world. It makes a difference, right? So the systems of knowledge को हमने उस वक्त भी highlight किया था. We were also concerned about things like governance and legitimacy, which is another way of calling the so-called hegemonic compromise. And so we were basically talking about, what alternative vision structures do we need in order to mobilize ourselves so that people's lives actually get better, rather than the narrative becoming just a fairy tale we use to put people to sleep. So that was the idea. तो वो आपको काफी इन चीजों में कॉमन लगेगी, और मैं इसके ऊपर इतना वो ज्यादा नहीं करता हूँ. सिर्फ एक चीज मैं कहता हूँ कि इस वक्त both Abbas and Aasim used the word hegemonic purely in a kind of a negative sense. There's as if there's something wrong in it. People like me don't think of it as in the negative sense, and Gramsci also did not think about it in negative sense. Gramsci में तो ये था ना, और ये जो integral state की आसिम बात करते हैं, उसमें तो ये था कि hegemony in some sense, not, I mean, I'm being a little bit simplistic, is an alternative to coercion. या आपने लोगों को थप्पड़ मारने हैं, या आपने लोगों को कन्विंस करना है. अगर वो कन्विंस हो जाए तो अच्छा है, अगर नहीं कन्विंस हो तो वो जबरदस्ती करनी पड़ेगी. एंड इट्स मच बेटर. इसीलिए वो स्टेट और सिविल सोसाइटी को कंट्रास्ट करता है कि सिविल सोसाइटी में जो है वो एक कॉमनैलिटी जो है हेजेमनी से बनती है. तो इफ यू कैन कम अप विद अ हेजेमोनिक आइडिया, you can bring people together and you can bring about some process of change and so forth. तो जैसे स्टेट के बारे में भी कहते हैं कि the state, Gramsci actually uses this term, the state is the limit of the hegemonic compromise. कि जहां पे आपकी देखें ना, अगर ये सारा हमारा ग्रुप है और हम सब एक चीज पे इकट्ठे हो जाते हैं तो हम मिलके काम कर सकते हैं. अगर हम कहेंगे नहीं, आधे लोग एक चीज पे इकट्ठे हैं, आधे दूसरे पे इकट्ठे हैं और कोई एग्रीमेंट नहीं हो सकता, तो फिर ये एक स्टेट बन जाएगा, ये दूसरा स्टेट बन जाएगा, जैसे इंडिया पाकिस्तान के या पाकिस्तान बांग्लादेश के साथ हुआ. ठीक है. तो द लिमिट ऑफ द हेजेमोनिक कॉम्प्रोमाइज, जिस जगह पे आप एग्रीमेंट कर सकें वो स्टेट बन जाती है, और उसके अलावा वो नहीं होता. हमारी पार्टीशन का और फिर बाद में बांग्लादेश टू नेशन थ्योरी का, और द ट्रेजेडी वाज कि the Quaid-e-Azam was constantly trying to come up with an idea of a hegemonic compromise. कि इस तरह से आप करेंगे तो हम इकट्ठे रह जाएंगे, नहीं करेंगे तो नहीं हो. In the end, Congress was too proud and did not agree. So the split took place. Bangladesh के साथ जो है, you know what happened. There was resistance of some sort, but no hegemonic ideas were offered to keep us together, and ultimately it had to break down. So the hegemonic compromise, to my mind, is a much more positive sense than the sense in which Aasim has used it. One other thing I might want to say also is that ये जो fear and desire, which I think Aasim is very right in sort of pointing to this as kind of the middle class subject की aspiration को fear and desire से करता है. But my sense also is that it's a much bigger thing. अगर आप Hobbes पढ़ें, तो you will find that it's really about fear and desire. That he says this is the human condition. You have an intelligent species, self-motivated. It is afraid to die, and it wants not only to survive but to do well. And he says this has created an impossible condition. And the only way to solve it, according to him, was the Leviathan. उसमें भी काफी चीजें हमारी ये liberal democracy वगैरह की उसने already उस वक्त डाल दी थी. So I would say that the fear and desire is much more universal than to my mind it appeared to be on first reading कि वो fear and desire को वो कर रहा है. Now Aasim has done something which I think in some sense, given the people that he cites, is a kind of a natural agenda. It's an agenda that comes naturally. Marx का भी agenda तकरीबन ऐसे ही था. What he has done is to challenge the current. It's not a hegemonic compromise, क्योंकि हमें पता है ना कि हमारे यहाँ तो जो एक किस्म का एक कॉमन नैरेटिव है वो उस पे इतनी ज्यादा कंसेंसस नहीं है जितना कि शुरू में जब हम पाकिस्तान बना था और डेवलपमेंट के ऊपर कंसेंसस था. लेकिन जो भी हेजेमोनिक नोशन है, जो हेजेमोनिक विजन है, उसको चैलेंज करते हैं. एंड और ये सोशल साइंस का मकसद भी होता है कि सोशल साइंस यही करे कि इट बेसिकली सोशल साइंस में काफी चीज जो होती है, आप ये कहते हैं कि अगर आप ये करेंगे तो ये होगा. Now, lots of time, because society is very complex, you only focus at little parts. And if it helps you understand things, or usi tarah hoti rahe, it's quite all right. But then you miss out something. Marx came out and said, no, don't look at the world like this. He said, look at the world in which who is being oppressed. When you look at it from who's being oppressed, उसमें inequality, उसमें oppression, उसमें violence, ये सारी चीजें नजर आएंगी. इन चीजों को खत्म करना, right? इसीलिए फिर वो labor movement became more the vanguard of this thing. So Aasim has also shown the light on the problems of the current hegemonic compromise. And he has looked at a number of those problems. जो land grab का issue है, he points to these 4 or 5 vignettes, but I think it's a much larger problem. I mean, the whole country has suddenly become populated with land grabbers. हर कोई कोशिश कर रहा है. आपकी यहाँ पे जमीन के ऊपर लोगों ने कब्जा करके बैठे हुए हैं. They are not the kind of people that Aasim talks about, but nevertheless, it's become very common. And it's partly the lack of governance, the partly our weakness of our judicial and other institutions. मगर जो भी है वो land grab जो है एक बहुत common है, and he points out the number of those things. Exclusion and violence of some groups, women, Baluchis, tribal areas ke log, Thar ke log, he brings out the fact that this kind of a violence is going on, and as a decent society, this is something that we should not have, we should not accept. Then he also talks about the environment, but only in passing. I mean, he never really focuses on this, but he does show that here is another problem that is waiting in the wings. Also talks about a little bit about the pathologies of politics, कि जी या अगर fascistic cults हैं या एक किस्म के corrupt वो systems हैं या dictatorial systems are waiting in the wings, तो इन सारी चीजों को भी करता है. तो कहता है कि जी आपका एक hegemonic compromise तो है, लेकिन उसमें ये problem है. You need to adapt this hegemonic compromise in order to find the right one. And he focused also directly on you. He says, you as a person need to find the hegemonic vision which will bring everybody to your table, right? So you are the middle class subject. आपके नाम में ये सब कुछ हो रहा है और आपने ही इसको transform करना है. And I think that's a very important message. So as in the 1980s, the hegemonic narrative has lost potency because of all of these problems. Now, one thing we should step back a little bit over here, and which is the following. And this is an area where I will probably disagree. कि globally जब हम देखते हैं 1980s में जब हम बात कर रहे थे, तो there was a period of kind of a emerging global pessimism, right? 1980s और 1990s हम कहते हैं the lost decades of development. Africa में per capita GNP नीचे जा रही थी, जैसे आजकल पाकिस्तान में जा रही है. Latin America, it had been flat for almost 20 years. Asia में थोड़ी बहुत मुल्क वो कर रहे थे, but China had not emerged. India was growing at 2% per year. Pakistan was actually doing better than the others. So overall, developing countries were really in a crisis, and people could say, "Yeah, kya bakwas hai? You've created a whole system around this, and nothing seems to be happening." But today, the world is not like this. China has come out of nowhere and build up this huge this thing, and has taken people out of poverty. It has created a kind of an hegemonic vision around which people have been able to coalesce. And China is not the only one. उसके पीछे अब ये बाकी East and South Asia, other than Pakistan and Afghanistan, वो उसके पीछे जा रहे हैं. The one surprise element which has fallen out is Sri Lanka, because of the particular kind of political development that took place over there. उसमें भी मतलब there are other things that we can say. So one concern I have is कि Aasim wants really for us to understand that Pakistan ki predicament is the global predicament, and that's a bit of hard sell. I think you will probably have to do a bit more sort of revision amendment about this, क्योंकि बाकी ममालिक में जो है वो दूसरे डायरेक्शन में जा रही. It is quite possible कि वहाँ पे भी कोलैप्स आ जाए, जैसे श्रीलंका में आ गया. अगर वहाँ पे आ गया वो भी हमारी तरह हो जाएंगे, मगर इस वक्त नहीं है. इस वक्त जो ऑप्टिमिज्म है चाइना की वजह से ज्यादातर, but also because of the other countries which are falling behind. So that hegemonic vision now does have some resonance. The other thing which I think Aasim is right, but he does not mention explicitly, is that inequality suddenly shot up like anything, right? पता नहीं आपने वो मिलानोविच का वो elephant curve देखा है कि नहीं? The global middle class has collapsed, right? So the top 1%, the top 0.1%, their incomes have shot up. Even the bottom 40% have also done some this thing, but the middle class has collapsed. and people are seeing this as one of the reasons for the rise of fascistic ideologies in developed countries, because उनका वो जो narrative है कि जी हमारी नौकरियां उधर जा रही हैं, that narrative seems to be supported by this. So inequality, I think, bears a little bit more mention here, and Pakistan has become one of the most unequal countries in the world, largely because of the nature of the state कि हम उसको extract करते जा रहे हैं और अपने उसको कर रहे हैं. Similarly, I think environment needs a much better treatment in creating the narrative that we are talking about. Then one additional point that I would make is, and this is the last point that I'll make, and here is probably where I tend to disagree the most. वो ये है कि यहाँ पे there's a kind of a schizophrenia in the book. Schizophrenia is तरह से है कि, you know, it very rightly points out the politics of hate. But the politics of hate is not only ubiquitous, it is also part of the narrative of the book. मतलब है book में भी हम फिर सोच रहे हैं कि अच्छा जी, maybe it is Malik Riaz who is the enemy, maybe it is the military that is the enemy, maybe it is Imran Khan that is the enemy, and that sort of a thing comes out. तो वो जो integrated vision है, वो चीज it begins to suffer because of that. I mean, the thing is कि ठीक है, there are always enemies, right? जब पाकिस्तान इंडिया आजाद हो रहे थे, तो बजाय इसके कि वो कहते हैं कि जी मुसलमान हमारे दुश्मन हैं, वो कहते हैं you know, let's try to find a compromise in which you'll be comfortable and we'll be comfortable. वो ये 75 साल हम जंग में ना गुजार देते, हम कोई ऐसा कॉम्प्रोमाइज कर दे, हमारी ऑटोनॉमी प्रोटेक्ट हो जाती, उनकी ऑटोनॉमी प्रोटेक्ट होती, and we could have lived peacefully. नहीं, ये नहीं किया, because the politics of hate was much more important than the politics of cooperation. And I think that the new narrative that needs to come up has to deal with this schizophrenia. It's a very natural thing to come to address some of these challenges. Related to this, there's a kind of a problem, which is that, you know, there's a kind of a moralization of politics जो पाकिस्तान में है. Moralization of politics in the sense that we constantly want to see politics as good versus evil, rather than politics as a way for us to live together. And the good versus evil tendency is you know, मतलब आप जब हमारी इस तरह भी politics को देखें, people think of leaders not as somebody who's going to, you know, lie through his teeth in order to get into power and then try to stick to power. And we have to try to make sure कि वो कोई ज़्यादा नुकसान ना पहुंचाएं, लेकिन जो भी काम उनको दिया जाए वो ठीक तरह से करें. हम उस तरह नहीं करते, हम उनको moralize कर देते हैं कि वो बहुत ही angels हैं और हर कोई समझता है कि हमारा वाला angel है, दूसरा वाला devil है. इस चीज़ से वो नहीं बात है. So there's a kind of a moralizing. ये Marx में भी थी. Marx also had a schizophrenia. देखिए, Marx was very clear कि मेरा scientific analysis है, you understand what I'm telling you and you will know how the society will change. But at the same time, he had a very strong moral streak. Not only do I have a strong, you know, scientific analysis, I can tell you exactly what's going to happen, लेकिन ये हमारे दुश्मन, right? तो ये दो sides जो है ना, वो उसमें भी reconcile नहीं. वो constantly वो utopians के और idealists के बहुत खिलाफ, तो कहता है यार जो science बताती है वो करो. लेकिन उसके साथ साथ ये moralism भी थी. तो ये चीज, I think this is also a sense, that especially when we are talking about empowering the subject, I think this is a challenge that I would like to see being done. Finally, there have been a lot of attempts done, not only Gramsci and Fanon and others, but there have been lots of attempts done to try to find this kind of a way for us to build a hegemonic platform. और इसमें conceptual challenges भी हमने किए हैं. You know, we have come up with different ways in which we have tried to understand this. The systems of knowledge, hegemony, philosophy of knowledge, etc., are parts of the way in which we sort of bring together people on a common platform. I have done a lot of work on scenarios कि हम future को देखते हैं कि future में क्या. All social science is really about the future. Even history is really about the future. हमारा मकसद ये है कि हम ये समझें कि ऐसे चीजें चलती हैं, तो अगर आप ऐसे करते जाएंगे तो ये होगा, अगर आप इस चीज पे पैर रखेंगे तो ये आपको सर में आके लगेगी, ये आपको बताना है, right? That is what social science is about. So when scenarios, which was a future oriented kind of thing, उसमें भी हम मुख्तलिफ विजन्स को देखते थे कि उनको कैसे आपस में हम इंटीग्रेट कर सकते हैं। और ये सारी चीज़ें जो इस किताब में आपने हाईलाइट की हैं, बार्बराइजेशन, फोर्ट्रेस वर्ल्ड, even the great transition, the kind of positive pathway, ये सब जो है उस चीज़ में किए गए। इसी तरह दूसरे जो कॉन्सेप्चुअल फ्रेमवर्क्स हैं कि जी इकोनॉमी को कैसे मैनेज किया जाए, ये जैसे एक रेगुलेशन स्कूल है which looks at the whole economic structure and tries to find कि how the different dimensions can be reconciled. I think those are some things that can be helpful, and maybe as you are developing this work further, it might be useful for you as to go to use some of those ideas. So in a nutshell, ladies and gentlemen, I really enjoyed reading this book. I thought that this is the same project that many of us have been working on for the last 30, 40, 50 years, and certainly for the last 200 years, jo sare idealist ek society hai. I also felt that this is an attempt to try to understand society, how society moves. I also thought that some of the elements that were introduced were important elements to bring about to pinpoint the things that have to be addressed. But I thought that there are a number of ways in which it could be improved. And I also felt that building that hegemonic compromise is not a bad idea. It's a good idea. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Banuri. When I was thinking about who to invite as the discussant for this event, one of the first names that came to mind was yours, because of your sort of nuanced take on things. And I remember you were here for Dr. Abbas Afzal's talk on surveillance capitalism just a few months ago, which I thought was tremendous. So I appreciate you and your feedback. In the interest of time, because we're just going to try to wrap up in about 20 minutes or so, we can move to Q&A. And alongside that, as Dr. Aasim is addressing questions, perhaps you could also respond to some of the points that Dr. Banuri has raised. So if anyone has any questions, please raise your hands and chime in.
Assalamu alaikum everyone. मेरा नाम कैसर इकबाल है और मैं अभी ग्रेजुएट हूँ डेवलपमेंट स्टडीज एमफिल पे. कॉन्ग्रेचुलेशन सर फॉर योर बुक. और जो मेरा सवाल है वो मेरे ख्याल से आप दोनों से होगा, डॉक्टर बनूरी से और डॉक्टर आसिम से, आपसे भी. डॉक्टर बनूरी साहब ने बात की कि हेजमनी हमेशा से नेगेटिव नहीं है. बिल्कुल जब हम ग्रामशी को पढ़ते हैं तो इट साउंड्स लाइक दैट, लेकिन आई फेल टू अंडरस्टैंड हाउ. फॉर इंस्टेंस अगर हम बात करें, अभी सर ने कहा कि हेजमोनिक प्रोसेसेस में या कॉम्प्रोमाइसेस में हम गुजार रहे हैं, तो उसमें हम उस सिचुएशंस जो है ना, यहाँ पर विन लूज सिचुएशन है, ये विन विन सिचुएशंस नहीं है. तो हम कैसे उन कॉम्प्रोमाइसेस के बाद जो सिचुएशंस बन रही है उनको विन विन सिचुएशंस के लेके आए? आपकी बुक के प्रेजेंटेशन से भी यही लग रहा था कि सिचुएशन यहाँ पर विन लूज है, नहीं कि विन विन सिचुएशन. थैंक यू.
My name is Rafi. I am a research fellow here at PIDE. So I have a question. Since I've not read the book, so I think I want. But drawing on your address, you mentioned that there is a crisis of liberal democracy, and since in Pakistan, I would like to say that we haven't had liberal democracy per se for the longest time due to a myriad of reasons. But throughout the world, there is a crisis that's going on. So my question is a bit theoretical, but bear with me for a while. I want to ask, do you think this crisis is in itself a failure of liberal democracy, or is it something that was inherently already present within its entire structure and now it's manifesting itself basically? So because there is, and I know there have been compromises, social contract and so forth, but if you look at it theoretically, there is an inherent struggle that always goes on between liberalism and collective democracy. There are compromises, how those things come together, but maybe because of that struggle, or maybe because of other reasons, it was already inherently present within the apparatus of liberal democracy.
सर बनूरी साहब से मेरा क्वेश्चन है, सर ने कहा कि इस बुक में शिज़ोफ्रेनिक एक उनको एस्पेक्ट नज़र आया. तो सर हम मतलब 70 साल से हम कंप्रोमाइज ही तो करते आ रहे हैं और कोऑपरेट करते आ रहे हैं, तो अगर हम इन लोगों से नफरत नहीं करेंगे तो चेंज कैसे आएगा? मतलब हम
Assalamu alaikum, sir. I'm Saddam Hussain, a research economist at PIDE. So my question, you were the external reviewer, examiner of my MPhil thesis. I wrote a thesis on Douglas North, the transition from limited access order to open access order. I hope you know. So In that, he mentioned some steps like how the transition will happen. He showed that these are the steps, the democracy, and we have to detach the individuals from organizations and etc. But when it comes to the blueprint, it becomes abstract. So like there's no clear way out. What I think that hegemony, fear, and these type of things have become an ecosystem. We cannot maybe remove it, but how much fear and how much hegemony should be allowed to have a proper functioning state? I mean, I guess that is the real question now, because you cannot eliminate the hegemony, you cannot eliminate the fear, you cannot eliminate the elitism. So the real question, I think, in the contemporary time is how much we should allow, how much we should, sit together and say, okay, this much hegemony and this much fear, so that we have a functional state and functional society. Thank you.
Well, first of all, I want to thank Dr. Banuri for his comments. I was expecting much more in the way of fireworks. They're considerably less, so I'll take that as that we more or less agree. And I really do appreciate that what he said, because I think that's actually what I'm trying to do in this book. I'm trying to rehabilitate this idea that these traditions of progressive thinking have always existed. And that there were what Fanon called them. There's a very classic passage. He says कि जब आजादी के अदवार में भी जब हर बंदा इस चक्कर में पड़ा हुआ है कि मुझे कौन सा ओहदा मिलेगा, there's still always what he calls honest intellectuals who are not moved by these promises of power and privilege, and who do retain this commitment to this transformative project कि भी हमने हकीकी मानों में आजाद होना है. It's not just about, some kind of switching just positions. So I think that's a very important point, that there's always been people, the generation who achieved decolonization, a subsequent generation, which I suspect you would put yourself into. And now I think what young people in particular to understand, because they don't have access to those intellectual resources. They have grown up in a world. I grew up in a world where it was, like I said, end of history, dood aur shahad ki nehrein, into the 80s, what you were describing, there was still a sense that, okay, even if the Soviet or socialist bloc hasn't proved to be a panacea, but there was still a probing, there was still an interrogation, there was still in this book, following, I never thought I would be following Deepesh Chakravarti, but following Deepesh Chakravarti is what he called anti-colonial desire, sort of a different kind of desire, a desire for, is the sentence that you wrote of freedom for all people. So that's an important, and I appreciate that is part of the lineage that you associate with, and I associate with, and as you say, all people who have thought about these questions for the best part of 200 years have associated with. I see your point, and I get it. Perhaps maybe a closer reading will convince you that I also share this perspective that hegemony is not just about brute, sort of the kind of projects that the elite has for us, but also some potential alternative project. It may be scattered, but it's there. And that relates to this question of win-win or win-lose. Look, I'm in that sense, I'm very much a disciple conceptually of Marx. This is a win-lose situation. You cannot have land grabbers and also meet people's needs. You're going to have to take something away from those who have too much to give it to those who have nothing. If you are rendering people surplus, you're evicting them from their livelihoods, you're evicting them from their lands, then it is already a win-lose situation. I didn't choose that. That's chosen by the kind of hegemonic order that is currently in place. And to displace it and to come up with, as in Dr. Banuri's words, a hegemonic compromise that is far more egalitarian, you will have to take something away. I said earlier that in terms of a project or a project of redistribution, aaj se 40 saal pehle is mulk mein to talk about land reforms was commonplace. We may not agree with it, but we had a period of history where the private industry was nationalized. National industry jo hai na mazdoor ko diya jaye. This was normal. This was in some ways a hegemonic idea itself.
कि ये भी एक तरीकाकार है. And that's been completely put off the table. बात ही नहीं होती. You don't hear question of land reform. I've said the other day, myself with Minto Saab as our lawyer, we filed a case in the Supreme Court 11 years ago कि जो आपने 89 में शरीयत appellate bench ने कहा है कि 77 का एक existing legislation है पाकिस्तान में. National Assembly has passed a law saying you cannot hold more than 200 acres of unirrigated and 100 acres of irrigated land. It's law. But probably you don't even know that. A lot of young people don't even know that. And all we know is that once upon a time, an appellate bench of the Supreme Court said, no, this is un-Islamic. And we came up with a series of legal arguments to say there's nothing un-Islamic about it, and no one wants to hear the petition. So you do have to take something away, certainly. Now, does that have to look like storming the bloody gates type of revolution? Well, it depends who you ask, but we can discuss that privately in case I might scare you with my answer. But it doesn't have to. I mean, I'm not saying it must look that way, certainly. And I'm certainly not, I mean, I hear Dr. Banuri's criticism. Maybe there's some subliminal hate in me, but I'm genuinely not moved by the politics of hate. I constantly talk about transcending these hateful sort of, in some sense, idioms of politics, even if it's from below. But we have to certainly understand why young people are moved and drawn to not just the Imran Khan type phenomenon, but why does a young, that Karachi suicide bomber, why did that happen? These are questions we have to ask. Why do young people in 6 years, quite aside from the machinations of the establishment, how is this thing called the TLP exploded into a mass organization? These are real people, right? Who are drawn to these things. And that, I think, is largely a question of, I think, two things. It's both about resources and redistribution. It's also about recognition. There's also a question of individual dignity that people who are drawn to these ideologies are trying to find. So I do think that win-win and win-lose is a bit binary. I think maybe if we look at it as a spectrum, we can move away from such, extremist sort of, let's say, articulations of politics to something that is more sort of balanced, but that will require taking away from the rich. There's no other way to do it. That will require demanding accountability for, people, as we know, who disappear people at will. And everybody knows who does it, but you can't do anything about it. That you can't have both of those things carry on and for everything to be, in a sense, stable and hunky-dory. So I certainly agree. Hegemony is, in Gramsci's understanding, is not just about what the ruling bloc does, but also is an alternative vision which you can bring together large numbers of. And that's a challenge. It's a challenge in this country in terms of identity, especially ethnic, the kinds of polarization we see and the way in which, for instance, the Baloch, to take an example, most prominently, have been, successively alienated. That's a challenge in terms of even women and oppressed genders. To be a woman in this country and walk down the street is like a luxury, literally, compared to many countries of the world. That's a challenge on many accounts. And it certainly requires out-of-the-box thinking, but it also requires like ठोस कि जिसके पास नहीं है उसको कुछ देना पड़ेगा, वरना they will not buy into this project that you call. But I hear your criticism about, you can't box Pakistan into all the global context. There's certainly uniqueness, and that's perhaps a longer debate about the extent to which the other countries are doing much or better or how much better. But I hear that. And of course, as you say, that's what sort of conceptual choices you make, right? When you have a bigger global scale of analysis, then you are going to make, there are going to be things that you're missing out, which are more contextual and specific. And that was a choice I made because I wanted to engage with other contexts, both our own and also Western contexts. And this brings me to the question of liberalism and democracy. A couple of decades ago, in the field of economics, there's a recognition, there's a lot of non-economic stuff that affects these so-called free markets, right? But as you say, there's often a very prosaic way of thinking about it. If I follow you correctly, you're like, look, maybe we can have a compromise that works for more people without thinking about some kind of radical. I'm not sure why we can't think about something radical to the left of the spectrum, because the right is doing a lot of radical thinking on the right of the spectrum, and they're winning. And I think that at the very least, like I said, story that to be on the left means to reproduce the Soviet model. I'm not saying this in this book. I'm saying that we need to think beyond that also. But I do think that there's something that we need to, Dr. Saab didn't talk about it, but I mean, how are we going to survive if we keep slashing our education budget? Like these are not radical in that sense. But if you don't have money, if you don't have resources to allocate to even things that, you know, once upon a time were commonplace, right? That you have to invest in health and education. And that is now on the chopping block. Everything else is on the chopping block. And whether we like it or not, these are now starting to constitute radical proposals. So I do think that one way or the other, there is going to be conflict that we have to accept. Conflict is a part of this story. What form that conflict takes, can we do it in a manner that all of us come together? As Dr. Saab said, I am speaking to everyone here. You know, whether you're a fence sitter or you're the silent majority, or you really believe in Naya Pakistan, it doesn't really matter where on the spectrum you fall. But unless every large segment, a critical mass of young people perceive themselves and imagine themselves to be part of the solution, then I sense that we are going to lose more and more ground, and we already have, especially on the question of ecology, you know, a lot less time than I would like, certainly. I do think that we have to be willing, I feel, to talk about rehabilitating progressive political horizons, and not assume that they necessarily mean that they will simply repeat, you know, the older lineage of political horizons. Now, what does that look like? That is something to be shaped. We didn't get a chance to talk about it. I think a lot of it will be shaped for us by the digital, because that has its own etiquette. You know, the kinds of discussions and debates we're having here is just not possible in online spaces. वहां पे तो बस आपने फायर मारना है, चढ़ दौड़ना है किसी दूसरे पे, और वही चीज फिर ज्यादा चलेगी जो ज्यादा सनसनीखेज है. And that is something really for us, I really believe we have to think about this, because that is the terrain in which the right thrives, and more meaningful, thoughtful places where you come together look different. लेकिन उसके बगैर तो मुझे कोई चारा नहीं नजर आता. बेशक आप कहें कि सबको हम लेकर चलें, लेकिन पहले आपको कहीं ना कहीं कोई झगड़ा तो डालना पड़ेगा. अगर आप झगड़े के बगैर समझते हैं कि ये हो जाएगा, मुझे नजर नहीं आ रहा. Not to say that I'm opposed to the idea, but I certainly don't see it, especially when you talk about inequality and depleting resource bases. And the fact कि भाई जिन खित्तों की हम, especially जो peripheral खित्ते हैं, you know, वहां के लोगों के लिए तो मरने जीने का सवाल है ना. ग्लेशियर पिघल रहा है, ठीक. अब आप जैकबाबाद जाएं, you know, maybe in 50 years Jacobabad will be uninhabitable. The forecasts suggest that extreme heat will make it impossible to live in those places. So how can we do this by tiptoeing around it? I don't think so. I think we have to acknowledge it and say, okay, how much of this is man-made, and a large part of it is, and a lot of that entails taking and redistributing, but also, as I said, thinking about how human dignity and recognition is these are intricately, I think, connected questions.
Just three quick comments. पहली चीज ये है कि when we talk about violence and ये जो हम देख रहे हैं, whether it is from the state or against the state, it is the failure of the hegemonic compromise. आप किसी को exclude करेंगे, उनको आप कोई रास्ता नहीं देंगे except to make life impossible for you. Right? आपने उनको इंक्लूड करना है. That is the first thing. So when I see these examples, I understand it, but I understand it partly as a way कि हमने कोई ऐसा कॉम्प्रोमाइज पेश नहीं किया जिसमें हम इन चीजों को इंक्लूड कर सकें. सो दैट इज आवर रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी एज सोशल साइंटिस्ट टू एंड पॉलिटिकल एक्टिविस्ट टू कम अप विद दैट कॉम्प्रोमाइज. जैसे मैंने आपको पार्टीशन का हवाला दिया, उस वक्त कायदे आज़म कॉन्स्टेंटली कोशिश कर रहे थे फॉर हेजेमोनिक कॉम्प्रोमाइज व्हिच विल इंक्लूड द इंडियंस, बट द इंडियंस, द कांग्रेस डिडंट वांट. Right, so कायदे आज़म्'s goal was कि इसको वो करें, तो फिर आखिर में हमें वो करना पड़ा. So the failure of the hegemonic compromise should not be used as an argument against presenting this. The second thing is कि देखें, all society is an artificial construct. ये सब चीजें जो हम कर रहे हैं कि अच्छा जी हमने इसको ऐसे करना है, ये करना है, ये सब हमने बनाया. ये डेमोक्रेसी, ये जो रोल ऑफ द मिलिट्री एटसेट्रा, ये सब आर्टिफिशियल कॉन्स्ट्रक्ट्स हैं. ये कोई भी प्रिमोर्डियल चीज नहीं है कि यहाँ पे इवन आवर एथनिसिटीज और सो फोर्थ आर आल्सो आर्टिफिशियल कॉन्स्ट्रक्ट. नाउ द थिंग अबाउट द sort of a hegemonic vision is in which जो एक्सट्रीम प्रॉब्लम्स हैं उनको आप एकोमोडेट कर लें, और जो लोगों के लिए इतनी जगह हो कि वो अपने आप को रिकग्नाइज कर लें. आई थिंक आई लाइक दिस phrasing which Aasim uses in the book. What we are looking for is distribution and recognition. Everybody is looking for that. We need a hegemonic compromise that brings about some of these things. तो अगर आप ये कहें कि अच्छा जी हमने नहीं करना, and without hatred we are not going to survive, so then yes, it chalks out a path for us. I don't see कि वो path हमें किसी उस जगह के करीब लेके जाता है. We do need a way in which we can sort of bring some of those things together. Related to this, and this is my last point, we do understand that the world may have moved from a win-win option in the 20th century towards win-lose, क्योंकि environmental conflict अब बहुत ज़्यादा हो गया, हमारी population बहुत ज़्यादा बढ़ गई, and if that is the case, it will be a battle. हमारी सोशल साइंसेस की रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी है कि उसी विन लूज को कन्वर्ट करें इनटू अ विन. राइट, दैट्स वेयर द हेजेमोनिक. आपने डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन की बात की, देखें, हेजेमोनिक कॉम्प्रोमाइज इन वेस्टर्न सोसाइटी वाज रीच्ड फॉर डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन. इट वाज कॉल्ड प्रोग्रेसिव टैक्सेशन, इट वाज कॉल्ड वेलफेयर सिस्टम, इट वाज कॉल्ड सोशल सिक्योरिटी. ये सारी चीजें उन्होंने की, हेल्थ, एजुकेशन, ये सब चीजें. दिस इज ऑल अ फॉर्म ऑफ रीडिस्ट्रीब्यूशन. ये उन्होंने किया. दिस वाज पार्ट ऑफ देयर कॉम्प्रोमाइज, एंड दिस इज व्हाई the specter that was haunting Europe did not materialize, because they found solutions. अगर वो कहते नहीं हमने कुछ भी नहीं करना है, इसको होल्ड बैक करके रखना है, they would all have gone the direction of the Soviet Union, right? So we have to find those solutions, and this is for the social scientists to do. इस वक्त टाइम हमारे पास इतना नहीं है कि हम उस डिटेल्स में जाएं, but it's a challenge that I put before Aasim. इसको इस तरह से अप्रोच करेंगे तो you put yourself into a dead end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Banuri. Let's have one more round of questions. I know we have people joining us on Zoom, so if we can get a couple from there and a couple more from the audience.
मेरा नाम अरसलान वर्दक है, मैं चार्टर्ड अकाउंटेंट हूँ और एक छोटी अकाउंटिंग प्रैक्टिस रन करता हूँ. आसिम साहब से जो क्वेश्चन है वो ये है कि उनकी किताब में मसाइल को तो एक्सप्लेन किया और उन्होंने खुद कहा कि सोल्यूशन वो ऑब्वियस है, लेकिन मेरे ख्याल है कि शायद ये टाइम है कि अब अगली किताब का अगर मैं जिसारत करूँ मौजू, तो वो होना चाहिए अब सोल्यूशन की तरफ, ख़ासतौर पे एक यंग आदमी के लिए कि उसके लिए जो है वो रोड मैप क्या है रेवोल्यूशन के लिए, और एक इनकलाबी पार्टी के लिए क्या रोड मैप है इस मुल्क के कॉन्टेक्स्ट में कि वो कैसे तब्दीली लाए. लोगों की इमेजिनेशन पे अब इसको नहीं छोड़ना चाहिए. प्रॉब्लम की काफ़ी डिस्कशन हो गई है मे बी, और ये ज़रूरी नहीं है कि वो बहुत ही प्रिस्क्रिप्टिव हो, लेकिन उसमें क्या चैलेंजेस आ सकते हैं और उनका क्या हो सकता है दुनिया के तजुर्बे से, इसके एक जिसारत करता हूँ कि वो किताब आप अगली का मौजू ये रखें. दूसरा ये कि किताब यहाँ पर अवेलेबल होनी चाहिए यहीं पर, ताकि उसको देखा जा सके, ख़रीदा जा सके, और लोकल बुक शॉप में भी अवेलेबल होनी चाहिए. डॉक्टर बुनरी साहब से जो है वो बड़ी अच्छी बात आपने की कि आप चाहते हैं कि लोग किताबें पढ़ें और किताबें लिखें. तो मैं ओपन क्वेश्चन करता हूं कि HEC के चेयरमैन के तौर पे कौन से ऐसे इकदाम किए गए कि जो यूनिवर्सिटियां हैं उनमें और कॉलेजेस में और इवन स्कूलों तक में भी लोग किताबें ज़्यादा से ज़्यादा पढ़ें, क्या बुक क्लब्स बनाए गए, क्या लाइब्रेरीज में इजाफा हुआ, क्या जो है वो स्टडी सर्कल्स को प्रमोट किया गया, क्या जो है वो स्टूडेंट यूनियंस के बारे में कोई काम हुआ आपके दौर के अंदर? और आखिरी बात ये,
just look at our undergraduate and graduate policies. बाकी जो लाइब्रेरीज वगैरह का काम है ये पहले भी चल रहा था and we have continued this. But the real thing is कि we have changed the way in which people conceptualize it, and also हमने प्रोफेसर्स की ट्रेनिंग जो शुरू की है उसमें इन सारी चीज़ों को हमने आगे प्रमोट किया।
ठीक है सर, आप जवाब में तफसील बता दीजिएगा। आखिरी बात ये कि मेरे ख्याल में कि शायद दुनिया में किसी को भी अपना हक बगैर मांगे या बगैर जो है वो जोर लगाए नहीं मिला। किसी ताकतवर की गुड जेस्चर के ऊपर या उसकी अच्छी नीयत के ऊपर रिलाई करना और बैठ जाना जो है ये मेरे ख्याल में मुनासिब नहीं है।
Thank you.
We are back to the same question.
Let's take a couple from Zoom. Shahid Mehboob is with us. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Abbas, and thank you, Dr. Aasim Sajjad. Thank you, Dr. Banuri. बड़ा ज़बरदस्त सेशन है. Really enjoyed it. डॉक्टर साहब की वैसे भी जो आर्टिकल्स लिखते हैं, I'm a fan of him, his writings. Wonderful discussion. एक दो quick comments because we don't have much time. सबसे पहले तो डॉक्टर साहब मैं अक्सर I complain to our PIDE's favorite lefty, our dear Surkha Abbas, and I keep complaining to him कि ये जो है like Imran Khan is a relatively recent advent, and if you take others too like Nawaz Sharif or PML and the socialists, the leftists have been here much before them. Why couldn't they become a force? Yeah, I put this question to him a lot of times, and one of the things अगर आप mind ना करें तो perhaps you need to look into your own those who call themselves leftists or socialists, कि perhaps there are ego chambers there too, right? जो कि वो उनको burst नहीं कर सके and they couldn't come over there. So you really need to think about why couldn't the left or the socialists become a force in Pakistan? They've been there for a lot of time. अच्छा, दूसरी चीज एक सर मैं आपसे in short मैं आपसे जिस चीज पे disagree करूंगा डॉक्टर साहब वो ये है कि यहाँ पे एक आप लोगों में एक ट्रेडिशन बनी है कि यू ट्राई टू ओवर सिंप्लीफाई थिंग्स। आपकी बहुत सी बातें जो होती हैं बिल्कुल ठीक है, यू आर राइट अबाउट इट। आपने अभी एग्जांपल्स बहुत सी दी, मिसाल के तौर पे आपने जो वहाँ पे सेटलमेंट्स की एग्जांपल दी कि किस तरह उनको इस्लामाबाद हाई कोर्ट के ऑर्डर पे फौरन उनको उठा के फेंक दिया गया। फाइन, ठीक है, बिल्कुल आपकी बड़ी अच्छी एग्जांपल है। फिर आपने सुप्रीम कोर्ट की एग्जांपल दी कि वहाँ पे कितने अरसे से केस पड़ा हुआ है तो नहीं चल रहा। लेकिन कुछ एग्जांपल्स ऐसी हैं कि यू आई रियली डू बिलीव कि उसको जनरलाइज करने से ज्यादा नुकसान होता है, उससे कोई फायदा नहीं होता। नाउ यू गेव अ फ्यू एग्जांपल, मिसाल के तौर पे आपने इंडियन फार्मास्यूटिकल्स की एग्जांपल दी और फिर कहा कि वहाँ पे किस तरह लोगों को एक्सेस नहीं थे कोविड-19 की वैक्सीन को। फिर आपने श्रीलंका की एग्जांपल दी, यहाँ पे एजुकेशन सिस्टम की अभी आपने बात की कि क्यों हमारा एजुकेशन सिस्टम का बजट जो है वो इतना कम है। देखिए इंडियन फार्मास्यूटिकल की एग्जांपल, सिंस this is one of my areas of research. Problem with COVID-19 was कि अचानक there was such a what we call a shock कि it wasn't possible to inoculate all the population. It wasn't possible at a certain time कि आप फौरन जो है सारी पॉपुलेशन में उसको जो है वो प्रोवाइड कर देते वैक्सीन। देयर वाजंट एनी वैक्सीन टू स्टार्ट विद, और जब बनी भी तो वो उसकी प्रोडक्शन कैपेसिटी इतनी नहीं थी कि सबको एक साथ प्रोवाइड हो सके। सो यू हैव टू कीप दैट इन माइंड। ये इस तरह मतलब जिस तरह इस चीज को ओवर सिंप्लीफाई करने की कोशिश की जाती है, देयर माइट बी अ सर्टेन एलिमेंट ऑफ ट्रूथ टू इट, बट ये इस तरह जनरलाइज करना कि जी उसमें वो हो रहा था और उन लोगों बहुत से लोगों को पॉपुलेशन को नहीं मिला। You have to look at some of the basics over there too, especially in production, vaccine production. अच्छा, दूसरी बात श्रीलंका की आपने मिसाल दी, तो सर श्रीलंका a lot of people say कि जी अब मिसाल देते हैं कि पाकिस्तान शायद श्रीलंका के उस पे चल पड़ा है और उस तरह ना हो जाए, लेकिन what I argue is कि श्रीलंका actually went the Pakistan way and that's why it went bust. Why? It doesn't lie in it opening up the economy or being too reliant on tourism. A lot of it has to do with the infrastructure they have been building over a decade or so. Loans ले के infrastructure brick and mortar build करते जा रहे हैं कि जी इससे तरक्की आ जाएगी, जिस तरह हम पाकिस्तान में करते आ रहे हैं, ठीक है। And a lot of that infrastructure is lying vacant. उसका कोई इस्तेमाल नहीं है, लेकिन वो कर्जे वापस करने का वक्त आया तो उनके पास कुछ है नहीं। तो actually Sri Lanka went the Pakistan way. It's not Pakistan going the Sri Lanka way. It's और फिर एक चीज लास्ट वन, आपने एक आउटसोर्सिंग की भी शायद बात की थी, तो सर गुजारिश ये है कि अगर आप अभी हमने पाइड का एक रिसर्च पेपर किया था, उसमें पाकिस्तान में सबसे ज्यादा जो अनएम्प्लॉयड हैं वो ग्रेजुएट्स हैं, ठीक है सर, तो ये ऑन ग्राउंड रियलिटी है। इफ दे हैव समथिंग टू डू विद देयर लाइव्स, बेशक वो फ्रीलांसिंग कर रहे हैं, बेशक वो किसी जगह बैठे कोई काम कर रहे हैं, किसी दफ्तर में बैठे पूरी रात गुजार रहे हैं, कुछ तो कर रहे हैं अपनी जिंदगी से, व्हाट वुड दे बी डूइंग सिटिंग इन देयर होम्स एंड डूइंग नथिंग, ठीक है, तो दैट्स वन थिंग, क्या करेंगे वो। और एजुकेशन सिस्टम की बात की कल ही, सिर्फ लास्ट वन सॉरी, एजुकेशन सिस्टम की बात की, इट्स नॉट अबाउट मोर एक्सपेंडिचर सर। अभी कल की मैं मिसाल देता हूँ, मुझे भी नहीं पता था, केपी में एक सिस्टम है एएमपी के दौर से कि आप बिटवीन क्लास 1 से क्लास 6 के किसी स्टूडेंट को आप फेल नहीं कर सकते, आप उसको प्रमोट करने से नहीं रोक सकते। तो वहां पे हाल ये है कि एक वो टीचर बता रहा था कि मैट्रिक तक भी पहुंचते पहुंचते उनका ये हाल होता है कि दे कांट इवन राइट देयर नेम्स। तो क्या इस तरह की एजुकेशन पे आपने सर्व करना है, खर्च करना है? थैंक यू।
Thank you so much, Shahid Saab. Let's take one last one. I know Jumme ka time hone wala hai. So, Dr. Idris on Zoom, please go ahead.
Dr. Aasim, thank you for this wonderful session. मैं सिर्फ ये पूछना चाह रहा था, आपने अपने रिस्पांस में लैंड रिफॉर्म्स का जिक्र किया है कि लैंडलॉर्ड के अलावा जो दूसरे ग्रुप्स हैं, लाइक जिनके इंडस्ट्रियल एम्पायर्स हैं या जो लैंड डेवलपर्स हैं, रियल एस्टेट टाइकून्स हैं, तो उनकी वेल्थ भी जो है वो कुछ कर सकती है जो एक लैंड रिफॉर्म लैंडलॉर्ड के जो इन्फ्लुएंस जो है करता है। तो व्हाई दिस एम्फेसिस ऑन लैंडलॉर्ड्स ओनली एंड व्हाई नॉट ऑन दोज हैविंग इंडस्ट्रियल एम्पायर्स, ये उन पे भी जो है आप लिमिट जो है सजेस्ट करते हैं?
Thank you, Dr. Idris. Please, Dr. Aasim.
Thank you. So very quickly, I hear what you're saying, Arsalan Saab, और आपकी ये पुरानी है, ये एक तरह से क्या कह लें, गिला कह लें, जो भी कह लें, अगर आपने पढ़ी नहीं है तो थोड़ा थोड़ा इस किताब में भी ये है, ऐसा नहीं है क्योंकि मुझे उससे अलग किताब लिखनी पड़ेगी, और क्योंकि वो अब इतनी जल्दी से तो एक अलग किताब लिखी नहीं जा सकती। एंड थोड़ा सा मैं उसकी वजाहत करूं कि यू नो व्हेन वी टॉक अबाउट द सब्जेक्ट, वी आर ऑल सब्जेक्ट्स, एंड इसमें जब आप कहीं माजी के भी हवाले देते हैं, उन अदवार के जहाँ पे लोग अपने आप को एक खास तरह से समझते थे, देखते थे, दे फेल्ट पार्ट ऑफ अ कलेक्टिव प्रोजेक्ट, उसका भी हवाला है। अब व्हेन यू आर सेइंग लाइक अ रोड मैप, लाइक समथिंग दैट इज वेरी फॉर्मुलेइक ऑलमोस्ट, कि भी ये I see what you're saying, and उसकी इफादियत अपनी जगह एक हद तक, but the truth is कि अगर आप कहें कि कोई रोड मैप है, तो I'm not convinced of that. I don't think there is something that approximates a roadmap as far as a formula. Sorry. I do think that certainly one can talk about, you know, big steps that need to be taken, right? For instance, some of the abhi jo debate hui ki land reform ki baat hui, and just to address Dr. Idris's question at the same time, certainly I've written about this at length. When I say land reform, I include urban land reform now. I think that's as, if not more significant now than just agricultural land. That includes real estate barons. In terms of subsidies, certainly big interests, industrial interests. So by all means, land reform का हवाला सिर्फ मैंने दिया था क्योंकि वो उसकी बाज़ाब्ता कोशिश हुई, और वो अभी भी सरकार उसको सुनने के लिए तैयार नहीं है, या कम से कम सरकार क्यों सुनेगा, बट कम से कम कोर्ट. So all of these aspects of the concentration of wealth need to be addressed. इस तरह की चीज तो कहा जा सकता है कि ये होना चाहिए, and that's domestic and international. Right now, this may seem out of left field for you, but it is out of left field. But you know, for instance, countries do voluntarily default on their debt. There is a tradition around the world where people say this is illegitimate, and I refuse to pay it. I say this often, and it's worth meriting a re-mention here. शाहिद साहब के लिए भी, हमारे लिए तो ठीक है, आप वो तमाम चीजें कह रहे हैं होनी चाहिए, आउटसोर्सिंग भी होनी चाहिए, सब कुछ होना चाहिए, लेकिन अमेरिका can have the world's biggest fiscal deficit running into tens of trillions of dollars. वहां पे तो कोई नुस्खा उसको वो नहीं मिलता. Now I'm not trying to just collapse all of these countries into the same bracket,
But I'm just saying that I am allowed, and you are allowed to disagree, to suggest that there can be different ways of thinking about our predicament. And that includes, what does development mean? You yourself are saying if development is not just about building roads and bridges, but I hope, I beg your pardon, but at the same time, you're also saying it is. कि मिसाल के तौर पे अगर किसी ने स्टार्टअप में काम करना, यानी कि कई चीजें आप कह रहे हैं जो चल रही हैं वो ठीक हैं, लेकिन कई चीजें जो चल रही हैं वो ठीक नहीं है. अब कौन सी ठीक है और कौन सी ठीक नहीं है? In my understanding, they are all part of the same broad model of development, or broadly what I would call contemporary capitalism, right? And it's partly to generate debate that I am saying कि ये बात हम करें कि ये क्यों, why is it that I am reduced to saying कि पढ़े लिखे तबके के लिए बस यही रह गया कि वो स्टार्टअप करें? क्यों भाई? वजह? Why can I not imagine a possibility, which was something that happened was commonplace in the early years of decolonization around the world, where you think about rural industrialization, rural public works, padhe likhe log going into even peripheries to be teachers and to be engineers and to be doctors. Ab aapko look, this sounds outlandish to you, but everybody has their own opinion. And I think that what I'm interested in is bringing back into the mainstream ideas that people somehow think कि ये तो बस पता नहीं ज़माना कदीम की बात है. आप ट्रेड यूनियन का हवाला दें तो इसका मतलब है आप पता नहीं 19वीं सदी की बात कर रहे हैं. तो ऐसा तो नहीं है ना. We cannot be so dismissive about alternative things. So I think a lot of that is there. And I am wary of offering a very clear formula. In fact, what I am offering in this book is to say कि जो आम नौजवान इंसान है वो इस वक्त किन चीजों की तरफ माइल होता है. Not blaming them, I'm saying observe that this is what is happening around you, and I'm appealing to that individual without necessarily offering a blueprint कि आप इसके अलावा भी कुछ आपको सोचना पड़ेगा, क्योंकि ये आपके लिए भी काफी नहीं है. राइट? अगर आपके 50% एमफिल्स या 24 औरतें जो है ना वो बेरोजगार हैं, I've read your paper about graduates, और अगर वो मर्दों की शरह जो है ना वो गालिबन 18 या 20% है, तो आप फिर भी कितने लोगों को नौकरियां देंगे? या एक स्टार्टअप चलती है 9 कोलैप्स कर जाती हैं. दैट्स नॉट सफिशिएंट फॉर मी टू से कि बस चूंकि निजाम के अंदर इतनी गुंजाइश है तो वो ही हो. बेशक वो हो, लेकिन उसके अलावा भी कुछ सोचने की जरूरत है. सो I hear you loud and clear, and I will write again, and I will augment what's in here. जहाँ तक आपने किताब की बात की, आपकी बिल्कुल दुरुस्त बात है. किताब अभी आपको कहीं मेरा ख्याल है बुक स्टोर्स में भी मुश्किल से मिलेगी. मेरे पास आई हैं वो सब दोस्तों को मैंने दे दी हैं. जो भी अगली आएंगी, आप में से किसी को चाहिए तो आप मुझसे ले सकते हैं. मैं कोई इसमें वैसे भी पैसा कमाना नहीं चाहता, तो अगर आपको पीडीएफ में चाहिए मैं आपको पीडीएफ में भेज दूंगा. पढ़ना आपको जरूर चाहिए, and hopefully we will get a local edition which is considerably cheaper. But फिलहाल के लिए वही आ जाए जो अभी छप गई है, तो एक कम से कम रसाई होनी चाहिए. I think I've answered more or less all of the questions. Yeah, one more question was Shahid Saab's perhaps most important question aside from our disagreements. Why couldn't the left, or why isn't the left a meaningful force? This is a very valid point. And if you'll read the book, I'm talking a lot to the left itself. And saying कि अंदर भी तो देखो, खुद भी तो जायजा लो कि हमारे अंदर के क्या रुकावटें हैं, हम क्यों नहीं एक हेजेमोनिक ऑल्टरनेटिव बना पा रहे. जहाँ झलकियां इस तरह की मिलती भी हैं तो वो इकट्ठे क्यों नहीं होते, बड़े क्यों नहीं हो जाते, क्यों हम अपने अपने जैसे आपने भी कहा एको चेम्बर्स में फंसे हुए. यकीनन ये एक बड़ा सवाल है, और उससे बिल्कुल हमें मुंह नहीं मोड़ना चाहिए. बल्कि अगर हम आपस में ये बातचीत नहीं करेंगे तो कौन करेगा? वो दूसरी तरफ से तो वैसे ही आप गद्दार वतन हैं, ये हैं, वो हैं, हर तरह का इल्ज़ाम आप पे है. तो उस पर उससे थोड़ा सा एंगेज करने से बेहतर है आपस में एंगेज करें, इन चीज़ों पे सोचें. और ये सब गौर तलब बातें हैं, इंक्लूडिंग I would say, and I'll finish with this, and I've said this to Abbas repeatedly, I think this is the time now, given the बिल्कुल जो हलचल मची हुई है हुक्मरानों के हलकों में, this is the time to mainstream a redistribution agenda again. A time to say कि यहाँ पे ज़मीन की इस्लाहात हो सकती है, यहाँ पे अशराफिया को हिडन सब्सिडीज ली जा सकती हैं, यहाँ पे आप रियल एस्टेट और कब्जागिरी को अगर आप रोक नहीं सकते तो कम से कम इस बात को तो मेन स्ट्रीम करें कि ये बात क्यों नहीं हो रही। तो एक ही बात हम करते हैं कि पेट्रोल सब्सिडी खत्म करो। मतलब मैं हैरान हूं, फ्रैंकली स्पीकिंग, द एंटायर स्पेक्ट्रम ऑफ डिबेट ऑन द इकोनॉमी इज व्हेन, दैट्स इट। और तो कोई हल है नहीं हमारे पास स्वाय इसके कि करनी भले आप करें, लेकिन इसके अलावा भी तो कोई बात हो सकती है। आई थिंक दैट इज सर्टनली समथिंग दैट progressive voices, individuals, organizations, researchers can coalesce around. Okay, if you do not have a redistribution agenda, at least start talking about it. चलो उसके लिए politics बनाना, एक political force बनाना जो उसको कर सके, वो बेशक अभी फौरी तौर पर मुमकिन नहीं है, लेकिन कम से कम वो एक consensus view तो बने कि for both reasons of human populations and their welfare, and also for environmental reasons, we desperately need to redistribute wealth.
Thank you so much, everybody. Appreciate you all.